Okay. Hello and welcome to this IUCN Red List webinar, everyone. My name is Janet Scott and I'm a Programme Officer in the Red List unit where I've been based for the last 12 years. Today we're really lucky we're going to hear from Professor Resit Akçakaya, the Chair of the Red List Standards and Petitions Committee. Resit was heavily involved in the development of the Red List categories and criteria and remains very involved in keeping the guidelines up to date and relevant with new developments. The purpose of these webinars is to provide some more support and guidance to all of you, members of the Species Survival Commission and others working on Red List assessments. This webinar is also being recorded and will be available on the Red List website afterwards. So once we've got that up, which will probably be in a couple of weeks' time, then feel free to go and watch it there again. During the registration process, you have the opportunity to raise questions you would like to be addressed, and Resit will be covering many of these over the next 90 minutes. It won't be possible to answer all of the questions you posed, but for those of you who asked questions which fall outside of the scope of this webinar, I'm getting back to each of you with a written response or advice on which resources you can consult. This webinar is also primarily aimed at those who already have a good understanding of the categories and criteria and of Red List terminology. So it won't go over the basics which are covered in the online Red List training course. If you haven't yet taken this course, I'd highly recommend that you do so, and I'll post a link in the chat so that you know where to find it. During the course of today's webinar, you can also use the Q&A function to ask any further questions which arise. At the top, you'll see you've got the options for chat and for Q&A. I'd prefer it if you could please use the Q&A, because then I can respond specifically to questions in turn. In the chat, it all gets lost and a bit confusing. For questions that you write, for some of these, I'll provide a written answer during the course of the webinar, and some I will refer to Resit to answer live already. Resit will also pause between sections to take any further questions, and at that point, if you'd like to ask a question yourself, you can unmute and do so, but please make sure you remain muted the rest of the time. Finally, please note that this webinar is a repeat of one which ran yesterday at an earlier time. We wanted to make sure that as many people as possible, based in a wide variety of regions, would be able to attend. However, today's edition won't be an exact repeat, as it will cover slightly different questions which were raised by those registering for this slot rather than the other one. So if you'd like to watch the other one too, both will be available afterwards on the Red List website, and you can consult both of them. So, thank you all for joining what promises to be a really interesting webinar, and without further ado, I'll now hand over to Resit, please.
Okay, hi everyone. Let me first share my screen. Thanks, Janet, for the introduction. I am Resit Akçakaya. I am chair of the Red List Standards and Petitions Committee, and I am a member of the Species Survival Commission. And like many of you, my involvement with IUCN is voluntary. And my day job is as a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolution at Stony Brook University, which is part of the State University of New York system. Before I begin the presentation, I want to remind you of these three resources for red listing that are important. The first one is the Red List guidelines. The committee that I chair revises these, updates them every other year or so. So we are now in version 16 in 20-something years. And what it does, this document does, is give guidance about how to apply the IUCN categories and criteria. And as the science of extinction develops and we know new methods, we add those to these guidelines. There is the Red List online training that Janet just mentioned. It's highly recommended for anyone doing Red List assessments. And finally, there's a new Red List platform that allows you to organize and and use your data to estimate the parameters that are needed for red list assessments. So again, I highly recommend that you check it out. Now, I want to start, as I usually do, with something about the purpose of the red list. Now, most of you already know this, but it is important to repeat because many of the questions we get are related to the purpose of the red list or about the misunderstanding of the purpose of the red list. So the purpose is classification of species according to their extinction risk. The purpose is not to list rare species or depleted species or declining species, species that need protection, to map for conservation, to determine conservation priorities, and anything else. Now, of course, the red list is used to determine conservation priorities, but as the red list categories and criteria state on its first page, it's not the sole means of setting conservation priorities. Now, as I said, I started with this important point because there are usually questions related to this, and there were several in this round as well. So I'll go through these questions and answer them that are related to this topic. So, for instance, one question was, is the IUCN likely to consider genetic diversity when assessing species diversity? So the obvious answer is, I don't know what IUCN is likely to do, but not with Red List, because Red List does not assess species diversity, right? Red List only assesses species extinction risk. Now, effects of genetics on extinction risk can be incorporated through criterion E. And there was a related question about whether we are planning on developing guidelines for using genetic information in criterion E. We don't have any immediate plans. And the reason is this: the way our committee works is that when we receive requests for evaluation of species assessments, either from assessors or from the Red List unit, some topics come up repeatedly, and then we decide that we need to cover those topics in the guidelines. And we have not received any criterion E assessments that use genetic structures. So we have not yet developed those guidelines, but if there are such assessments, then we will consider doing that. Another question that came in this round is related to the problem of IUCN classification and research and conservation funding. The issue is that some species have been classified as least concern, but without threatened listing, it's difficult to get funding to start research. So again, Red List only measures extinction risk. It does not measure your funding ability. Manipulating the extinction risk category for any purpose whatsoever, either to get funding or because you think listing at a higher risk will help the species, or any other speculation about the effects of listing itself, is not allowed, because that would harm the conservation of the species in the long term, because it will diminish the credibility of the Red List. Red List does one thing and it does it very well. If you want to do other things, then you have to find other ways of doing it. So the only thing Red List does is assessing extinction risk. If you want Red List to do other things, you will be disappointed. Okay, continuing with this theme, another question that came again for this round was, should the IUCN categories be focused solely on extinction risk when numbers are so low that species are not able to perform the same ecological roles that they did in the past? Well, interesting question. Another was how to use the Red List status to determine success of conservation efforts, the impact of our work. Again, my answer is that Red List does not do any of these things. It does not measure ecological roles. It doesn't measure conservation effort. It only measures extinction risk. But obviously, extinction risk is not the only important metric in conservation. It's just one of many, right? There are many other important things that we want to know. For instance, how far the species has declined from historical baselines. In other words, what do we need to do to avoid the shifting baselines syndrome? To what extent does the species perform its ecological role? That's related to this first question. How much did the species recover, and how much of that recovery can we attribute to our conservation efforts, which is related to the second question. So Red List doesn't do any of these, but all of the above can be addressed by the IUCN Green Status of Species, which is a new IUCN knowledge product. It was approved only a few years ago. And it's a global standard that does two things: measure species recovery and compared to a historical baseline, and assess conservation impact. And the species recovery is measured based on 3 dimensions of species recovery: viability, functionality, and representation. So if you want to assess anything related to species recovery or conservation impact, I strongly encourage you to read about the IUCN Green Status of Species. I won't talk any more about it because this is not the topic of this session. But now I'll return back to the Red List. Before I go on to the next topic, are there any questions about this first part? What I will do is after I finish a topic, there are about, I think, 6 of them. I will pause and ask for questions about that topic so we can cover more ground, and it can be fresh in your mind. So any questions?
No one has written any questions. If anyone would like to unmute, they're welcome to do so.
Okay. By the way, if a question occurs to you about a topic that I already covered, please still write it in Q&A because we will likely have time at the end to cover questions on any topic. So whenever you think of a question that you would like to ask, please add in the Q&A. Next, I want to talk about uncertainty. Again, this is a topic that is quite important, and always there are questions related to it. So as we know, all data in science are uncertain, especially in conservation, and especially with respect to threatened species, data are lacking and uncertain. So the way we deal with this in the IUCN Red List is that we specify everything in terms of ranges. So instead of a single number, we enter an interval. Of course, if you don't have any data, you don't enter anything. But if you have any data, you can enter it as a range, or you can enter as a range plus the best estimate. And the best estimate itself can be a range. The criteria calculator in SIS then propagates these uncertainties from every parameter, and at the end, the results may be expressed as a range of categories. So instead of just, for instance, endangered, it can say endangered to vulnerable, as in this example here. So questions that are related to this topic. So one question was, when are data poor species not data deficient? And another one was, when do we need to consider what do we need to consider when working with data poor species? What are the minimum data that can be used? So the basic procedure for any of these cases is that first, you enter all available information in SIS with realistic uncertainty bounds. use the SIS criteria calculator. The SIS criteria calculator, as I said, will give you a range of categories. If that range of plausible categories includes both critically endangered and least concern, then that species should be assessed as data deficient. Another question, again related to this topic, was if there are data for a species but not adequate for a stock assessment, should we consider it as data deficient? No, definitely not. The only way to consider if the data are sufficient or not is to actually enter them into the system and see what the result is, right? And especially in this case, because there are many cases where there is not enough data for stock assessment, or in any other taxonomic group, it will be called abundance estimation. But there are still sufficient data about the trends in habitat, trends in range of the species, trends in an index of abundance, even if we don't know exactly what the abundance is. So even if you cannot find information to know the abundance or stock, you can do a red list assessment. A more specific question was how to assess a widespread species with few and very small populations. Now, again, the general answer is the same. Always enter all available data to SIS, specify all data with uncertainties, use the calculator, and do not predetermine which criteria to apply. Enter the data, even those data that you don't think will contribute to the listing, because those data may actually contribute in the future. Now, in this particular case, widespread species with few and small populations, the important quantities will likely include mature individuals, number of mature individuals, both total for the whole species, but also in the larger subpopulation. In addition, because the populations are few and very small, area of occupancy, severe fragmentation, and number of locations may be important. But as I said, I would advise you to consider all other data, especially related to declines and reductions, which is an important topic, which will be my next topic. So questions about uncertainty, data deficient.
Okay, no one's written anything yet in the Q&A or in the chat.
Okay. I hope everyone is hearing me. Is everyone hearing me?
I can certainly hear you.
Okay. Well, if you don't hear me, write it in the chat so we know there's a problem. Okay. Continuing with reductions and declines. Now, this is a complex topic. There are various different criteria that talk about declines and reductions. So I organized these in first two categories. There are continuing declines and reductions, right? The continuing declines are recent, current, or projected future declines, which are liable to continue unless remedial measures are taken. And reductions may or may not be continuing. So reductions don't have to continue. They may have ceased already. Continuing declines, there are two types of them. One type that is used in criteria B and C2 are true-false type of continuing decline. In other words, it's either there is continuing decline or there is no continuing decline. And these can be inferred. And the other kind is in C1, and it has to be it's called estimated continuing decline. It has to be observed, estimated, or projected. It cannot be it cannot be inferred or suspected. And it is represented as a percentage, not as true false, right? Not as decline or no decline, but as a percentage of decline. And the reduction is also expressed as a percentage, but there's a difference between C1 continuing decline and criterion A reduction, both in terms of time frame and in terms of percentage. So in C1, the number of generations or years depends on the threat category, whereas in A, it does not. And importantly, there are different additional conditions for continuing declines to actually determine the threat category of the species. For criterion B, continuing decline by itself is not sufficient. You also need a small area of occupancy or small extent of occurrence, and combination of locations, fragmentation, or fluctuations. And for C2, you need mature individuals or fluctuations. In C1, the only condition that's necessary is number of mature individuals must be below a certain number. And importantly, for criterion A, there are no additional conditions. So only reduction by itself is sufficient. So I realize this is a lot to take in, but those of you who know the Red List criteria already would recognize these differences. And these, as I said, are complex topics that are covered in several different sections of the Red List guidelines, and these sections are updated frequently. So please refer to them when you need to use these terms. Now, a number of questions that came in for this webinar involved about how to make projections of population reduction. So the projections are made under criteria A3 or A4. A3 is future reduction. A4 is a combination of past and future reduction. They are both 3 generations, but A3 is starting from now and going 3 generations to the future. A4 is 3 generations that can be 1 generation past and 2 generations future, or 2 generations past and 1 generation future, or any combination in terms of number of years. So what are some of the examples of how we can project population reduction into the future? One way is to extrapolate the current rate of decline if threats are not decreasing and are not likely to decrease in the future. For instance, if the population declined by 30% in the last 1 generation, and the threats are not decreasing, the same threats are there, and they are not likely to decrease in the future, you can project it the same percentage decline into the future by 1 generation, right? Or 2 generations, or if you have 2 generations in the past, you can project only 1 generation and you'll have your 3 generation window. Another way is to use population models or demographic models to project reductions. Obviously, developing these models requires population ecology expertise. There are a lot of guidelines on this in the guidelines document, and you can use, even though that is in the section on criterion E, you can use the same methods to calculate reduction under criterion A. Use the same guidance about developing models. Another way is to use disease models to project reductions. This is also rather complicated, but I'll get to it in the next slide. You can use bioclimate models combined with projections of climate change, and I'll talk about it a bit later. And you can also infer reduction based on observed reduction in parts of the range of a species under particular threats, and make assumptions about future spatial scope and intensity of those threats. So for instance, part of the range is already under a threat and the species has declined by X percentage there. Another part is likely to is predicted to become under the same threat in the near future. right? So you can then, knowing how the species responds to that threat, by how much reduction, you can extrapolate that to the rest of the range and calculate an overall reduction. And that will be an inference, not an estimation. You can also suspect reduction. So reductions can be suspected, inferred, estimated, objected, observed, or projected. You can suspect reduction based on the responses of other species with similar life history traits and subject to similar threats. So if the same threat in the region is affecting another species with similar life history characteristics, then you can suspect that when that threat affects the species you are assessing, it will also respond with a similar reduction. Finally, as I mentioned, you can combine one or two generations of past reduction with 2 or 1 generations of projected future reduction to calculate A4 reduction in the 3-generation window. This is especially useful for long-lived species for which making future projections becomes very uncertain after 1 generation. And also, going back in time after 2 generations, the data is less available and less certain, and there's more uncertainty about the data in the distant past. So this way you can combine more recent and more reliable data on reduction with a short-term projection instead of a long-term projection. Let me briefly talk about the disease stuff. So there was a question about the impact of avian flu. Now, my answer is not about avian flu because I don't know anything about this disease. But in general, the type of information that will be useful to assess a species impacted by a disease that is spreading is, first of all, the rate of spread of the disease, how many kilometers per year, that sort of thing, and how it is varying from year to year or place to place, the general variability. The current locations where the disease is detected, probability of occurrence at a new locality, and the immunity or susceptibility of the species to disease. Now, if you have this type of information, please see the methods that we used in a recent paper on a fungal disease that's affecting salamanders in Europe, and see if you think that same methods can may be applicable. This paper, the supplementary material, includes an Excel spreadsheet template for applying criteria A3, D2, and criterion E to the type of information that I listed above. Again, it may not be applicable to all cases, but it is worth it's worth a check. Okay, next I'll talk about climate change. Any questions?
No one has written any questions. I guess we just have a quieter group than yesterday.
Okay.
You must be answering everything already.
Okay, so climate change, of course, is a difficult topic, a threat that is impacting many species, and its application to read this criteria is complicated. So that is how to think about climate change in the context of Red List is covered in section 12.1 of the guidelines. That was written maybe about 10-15 years ago. But earlier this year, we substantially revised this section. We asked 15 climate change modelers to give us ideas and input about how to update this section with new information, new findings, and new methods. And this resulted in substantial change to sections on using bioclimate models. Now, bioclimate models are also known as species distribution models, SDM, or ecological niche models, ENM, and they are used to infer in the context of red list population reduction and continuing decline. Now, in revising this section, we also realized that what will really help both the assessors and the reviewers and us, the committee who is usually asked to review these models, is a standardized way of summarizing the information that goes into these models so that we can easily see what is missing and what is needed. So what we decided is to organize this into a new template for supplementary material. So as you know, red list assessments can include supplementary material. And if you are using a model to assess the species under climate change, a bioclimate model, you are now asked to complete this particular type of template. And I'll briefly describe what is in this. So there are, let me see, 6 sections. The first section is very simple. It's just taxon, whether it's global or regional assessment, etc. Basic information. The second information is species data. Now, I don't know how many of you know about bioclimate models or species distribution models. For instance, Maxent is one of them. Maybe you have used it or you have heard about it. These are basically regression models, right? Statistical models. Because they are statistical models, they have a response variable and a number of predictor variables or explanatory variables. So in this case, the response variable is the species data. And there are 2 types of species data. One is occurrence data, where we see the species, and the other one is where we don't see the species, absence data. So these are called presence absence data. In some cases, in most cases, you don't have absence data. Instead, you use background data or pseudo absence data. But you have to have both occurrence data and background data or pseudo absence data in order to use these models. Okay, so section 2 is about the response variable, which is the species data. Section 3 is about the predictor variables, which are the environmental variables that determine if a location is suitable for the species or not, right? And those include climatic variables, obviously, because they have to describe the effect of climate change on the species. And in order to be able to do that, you have to have climate models. But also non-climate models are in most cases needed, like landscape variables. Then the template asks for details of the bioclimate model. So which modeling approach you used. So for instance, for most of the assessments that have come in so far, this would be Maxent, or some people use random forest, but which statistical method you use, and some details about that. And then, of course, the results, how did you calculate the results and what was that result, and then references. So this template quickly allows the assessors to see what information is missing and what information they need, and allows us to quickly evaluate if the model is a robust model that should be trusted. So I won't go into more details of this, because that will require actually not one more webinar, but a set of webinars on its own to really teach how to do this for those of you who don't. But we realize that some specialist groups and red list authorities do not have the capacity to do these assessments. So if you have species that you think are impacted by climate change, and you think you have these types of data that can be used for modeling, but you don't have the capacity to do the modeling yourself, I strongly encourage you to contact the climate change specialist group. There are plans for the climate change specialist group to provide assistance or, I don't know, some sort of matchmaking between modeling experts and Red List assessors to increase the use of these models in Red List assessments. Any questions on this? I will next be talking about inferring extinctions.
The only question that's been asked is a request to share the actual Excel worksheet by somebody who can't access the full text of the journal article. But it looks like we can't actually put attachments in the chat. So I'm going to get in touch with Rachel, who asked that separately, and follow up outside the webinar.
I will send you the file, and you can. But I will actually send you the whole thing because you really need to read the paper to understand what the Excel spreadsheet is asking for. I'm assuming this is about the disease model, right?
Yes, sorry, the disease model.
Okay. Next is inferring extinctions. So this is about deciding whether a species is extinct or possibly extinct. And it helps you decide how to list the species that might be extinct. Now, if the species, according to this results of this analysis, is extinct, but it is in captivity, then it will be, of course, extinct in the wild, not extinct. And it will be critically endangered, possibly extinct in the wild, not critically endangered, possibly extinct. So I won't repeat everything with the in the wild part. That is given if the species is in captivity, it's not extinct, it's extinct in the wild. So this is the question of species that have not been seen in a while. And when do you actually say this species is extinct? This is a very difficult question, obviously. And so let's start with the definition of extinct in the IUCN Red List. So the definition is that there is no reasonable doubt that the last individual has died. But the operational definition, the one that is used for listing species as extinct, is basically presumed extinct, which is when exhaustive surveys in known or expected habitat at appropriate times throughout the range of the species failed to record an individual. So the critical part here is that, of course, the species is not seen for a while, but how hard did you actually look for it, right? Can we consider the surveys exhaustive? That is the main question, because if you don't see the species for 50 years, but no one actually looked for it either, then it's hard to call it extinct because it may still be there. So how do we know the surveys have been exhaustive? There are three basic variables that determine this. One is the area surveyed, what proportion of the species habitat within its likely range was surveyed. The second one is detection. The probability that if the species were present at the site that was surveyed, how likely are you to actually record it, right? And this has to do with CRIPSes and timing of the surveys and whether you were there at the right time, whether the right experts were looking for it, if they saw it, would they actually recognize it, that sort of thing. And the third one is correct identification. Given that it is recorded, what is the likelihood that it would be correctly identified as the species in question? And this is an issue for species that are very similar to other species, right? So that is the important parameter. If the species is unique, then correct identification probability would be close to 1, because once you record it, that is very likely the correct species. So what we did a few years ago is expanded section 11 on extinct and critically endangered, possibly extinct. to add guidance and examples for determining these three quantities that I just mentioned. And this was based on three papers that were published by myself and I think maybe 20 other people. And these three papers actually were published in 2017, but the first workshop that we actually held to think about this problem was in 2010. So basically it was a this Red List guidelines were updated in 2019. So it was basically a 9-year work to get to this point. Now, in addition to this three quantities, there is a separate model based on threats that also is also used to determine the likelihood that the species is already extinct. And there's a spreadsheet template for organizing the available information. I think Janet has already put this URL in the chat. So that is the URL from which you can download the guidance, the spreadsheet template, and the R program to calculate the probability. And there's also guidance on how to interpret the results and avoid mistakes. So the template that you have to fill it looks like this. There are 3 tabs that you see at the bottom here that you have to fill. One is called threads, the other records, which is when was the species actually seen. And third one is surveys, when did you look for the species or anyone and did not see the species. And those 3 tabs are then used with this R program. Now, even if you don't know how to use R, this should be quite simple because all you have to do is enter the name for the species and enter where that file is, where this template file is, and that's it. Then you run this code and it gives you this picture, right? So this picture here is giving the probability that the species is already extinct based on 2 different ways of looking at it. One is called the threats model. The other is called the records and surveys model, right? And if the result is in this corner at the very right, top right, meaning that the probability that the species is already extinct is over 0.9 for both methods, then we call the species extinct. If it is not there, but if it is in the top right quadrant, in other words, the probability that the species is already extinct from both methods is above 0.5, above 50%, then we call this, we recommend that you assess the species as probably extinct. And if it is not in the top right quadrant, if it is anywhere else, then we recommend that you assess it as threatened. Now these thresholds are recommendations, so you can justify using different thresholds if you choose to. But the important thing is to demonstrate that the surveys have been exhaustive. Right? That's what we are trying to get at. Any questions on inferring extinction? I don't see any questions. Okay.
We do have a hand up. Sybil, you should be able to unmute if you'd like to.
Yes, I think I'm unmuted. We're good?
Yes.
Yes, okay. I just, I'm sorry to get you all excited about a question, but it's just something you already said. If it is outside that little red corner, what should we be assuming? Like I'm from Canada and we have species here over huge wide landscapes that haven't been seen in 50 years. And I have not done the calculation, but if someone were to, and they wind up outside that little red corner, Do we, you said, I mean, what do we call it? It's not doing well, that much is clear, but.
Yeah, so if it is outside this corner, but in the top right quadrant, then we call it critically endangered, possibly extinct.
Possibly extinct. Okay, that was the part I missed. Sorry about that. It was probably obvious to everybody else, but thank you.
It may not be actually. So possibly extinct is not a category. Unlike extinct, extinct is a category, critically endangered is a category, extinct in the wild is a category. Possibly extinct is a tag attached to critically endangered category in cases where there is high likelihood that the species may already be extinct. And the reason we do that is that there are risks, or not, I shouldn't say risk, there are costs associated with listing a species as extinct if it is not already extinct. And we don't want to make that mistake. It's called Romeo error, based on, of course, the tragic ending of Romeo and Juliet. You know, you think it's dead, then it dies because of that sort of thing. And in order to avoid that, assessors are understandably reluctant to call a species extinct. But letting them to assess the species as possibly extinct allows us to have a better idea of the extent of the extinction crisis without writing off any species as extinct, right? But of course, if the species has very high probability of being extinct, if it has not been seen for 50 years and there were targeted surveys for 50 years, it is very likely that the result would actually be in this corner. So anyway, any other questions?
Actually, just following up, I like very much that idea of the Romeo error. I think we fall into that sometimes. And is there a reference for that we can use?
Yes, in the Red List guidelines, if you look at this section on extinction, there are references to those 3 papers that were published in 2017 that cover, one of them specifically covers the costs and benefits of different decisions, or actually the costs of, mainly the costs of the 2 types of mistakes, the type 1 error and the type 2 error, right? Saying a species is extinct when it is not, and saying that it's not extinct when it is. And there are different costs associated with those. So a paper that I was the lead author on discusses those. And the 2 other papers describe these 2 models that are shown on the 2 axes of this graph. So take a look at those references.
Thank you very much.
I have to say that we were not the ones who came up with the label Romeo error. I wish I was, but someone much cleverer than me thought about it. Nigel Culler, many years ago, coined this term. Nigel Culler from BirdLife International coined this term. And in our paper, there's a reference to his paper where he actually coined the term. Okay. Okay, next, subpopulations versus locations. This is a set of complex topics that have to do with severe fragmentation, subpopulations, locations, etc. So let's get going. So one question I got this time was, when assessing a subspecies, what terminology to use, subpopulations, occurrences, or locations? Well, whether it is subspecies or species, it doesn't matter. These 3 terms are completely different from each other and they mean completely different things. So occurrence is a single locality where the taxon's presence has been recorded. This is usually specific geographic coordinates, a point on the map, basically, right? That's what occurrence means. And it's used in the Red List in the definition of extent of occurrence and area of occupancy, and also in models of species distribution, we refer to presences as occurrence points. They are the same thing, basically. Subpopulation is not a point on the map. It's a biological population. And in the red list is defined as a geographically or otherwise distinct group of individuals of the same species that has little exchange with similar groups. And the concept of subpopulation is defined and explained in section 4.2 of the guidelines. And finally, location is completely different. It's a geographically or ecologically distinct area in which a single threatening event can rapidly affect all individuals of the taxon present. Now I want to go a bit more into this definition. So this is the definition of location. Now, I wish that when in 1999 we were revising the criteria, we actually didn't use the word location and changed it to area of threat, because that is really what it is. And it's really better to think of it as area of threat, because the word as it is defined is so different from general notions of location and locality that it is leading to a lot of confusion and misapplication of the criteria. So think of it as area of threat. Now, why is this in the Red List guidelines? What it is trying to measure is actually somewhat related to what area of occupancy and extent of occurrence are measuring, which is risk spreading, right? Insurance against spatially explicit threats. So if there are different threats in different parts of the range of the species, that means that the threats are the risk is spread because one event can take out this subpopulation, another event can take out, this part of a subpopulation, but they are two different events, right? That is risk spreading. Another point is that if there are no threats, then sub-criteria based on location are not met. In other words, if there are no threats, you cannot say number of locations is 0. You have to say that the sub-criteria in which the number of locations are used are not met, which is the same thing as saying that there are many more than 10 locations. So definitely not 0. Now, a common question that comes up is that, okay, so location is based on threats, but I have a species that is under threat in one part of the range, but there are no threats in the other part of the range. What do I do in that case? Well, in that case, you can use one of the following options and read about them a bit more in the guidelines, but the point is it's up to you to select one of them, right? Now, the first one is that you don't use location. Assume that the sub-criteria that refer to the number of locations are not met, just as if, as in the case of there are no threats. This is only applicable or only appropriate when the unaffected area is large. So if the unaffected area is large and only a small part of the taxon's range is affected by a threat, then it's okay and appropriate to say that we will assume that location criteria are not met. Okay. Another option is that the number of locations in the affected areas are calculated according to the guidelines based on threats. In the unaffected areas, the number of locations are set to the number of subpopulations in those areas. And this is appropriate if especially if those subpopulations are small, because the idea is that if the subpopulations are small, then they are under risk of extinction due to demographic stochasticity or Ali effects, and they, especially small populations, and that risk will be actually independent for each subpopulation. So you can count each subpopulation as a separate location in that case. The third option is a bit more complicated. the number of locations in the unaffected area is based on the smallest size of the locations in the currently affected areas. So you look at the currently affected areas, there are, let's say, 3 locations. The smallest one is, let's say, 20 square kilometers. What you then say is that every 20 square kilometers of the unaffected area, I'll assume is 1 location. And the idea behind this is that even though these threats are not affecting the other areas, they may in the future affect them. So basically, it's only appropriate where you think that you don't know the threat is affecting, you don't know what threats are affecting the other areas. There may be, you just don't know. In that case, you can use this option. And the final one is that the number of locations in the unaffected areas is based on the most likely threat that may affect those areas in the future. Again, this is based on an expectation that there is very likely a threat that will happen in the future. But if no part of the range of the species is affected by a threat currently, you cannot use this argument. You cannot use location at all. So what I said before stands. If there are no threats at all right now, then locations cannot be used. Okay. Now, one confusing thing about location definition is this term that I highlighted, which is a single threatening event. So the area affected that you have to calculate is the area that's affected by a single occurrence of the threat, not the whole area affected by that type of threat. So for instance, if the threat is that there may be, let's say, mining activity, right? The threatening event is one mine that is, that is constructed and the land is stripped and that's affecting that area. And that is a single threatening event. And now, if multiple mines are controlled by the same company and the decision to open them or not are made by the same company, then multiple mines can be considered to be a single location, or locations where those mines can be placed can be considered as a single location. So there are some other examples of these in the guidelines. Please take a look at them. And if your case is not similar to any of them, please send the details to me so that we can consider them and we can perhaps include a generic version of it in the guidelines to help other people with the similar case to yours. Any questions?
No one has written any questions at the moment.
Okay. So the last topic I want to cover is another complicated one, which is often misapplied, which is about severely fragmented. Now, the definition in the red list categories and criteria is that most of the individuals are in small and relatively isolated populations, subpopulations. So basically, severely fragmented is about population fragmentation, not habitat fragmentation, but it is often inferred based on habitat information. So there are 2 critical things to decide. Small, if the individuals are in a small subpopulation, and if they're in an isolated subpopulation. So small means that it's a population that is not viable. In other words, without exchange with other subpopulations, it is likely to go extinct in the future. It has a high likelihood of going extinct in a short period because it is not viable by itself. Isolated means that if a population goes extinct, it is so far away from others that it has a very small probability of recolonization. Then, after you decide this, and there are guidelines in starting with version 15, we added more guidance on what we mean by small and what we mean by isolated. So small populations that may go extinct is the critical thing here. So the size of the population alone is the cause of increased risk of extinction. You don't need decline, etc. Right? And someone has asked if the concept of minimum viable population is applicable here. It is not applicable. So for most species, this number will be at the very least in the low 10s. So numbers like 10, 20, 30 individuals should probably be considered as too small for any subpopulation. And the population size in the hundreds is probably large enough. So it's basically between those two, in the low 10s versus hundreds, that's the range where you decide what viable population is for your species. Other evidence that you can use, again, these are in the guidelines. If a population has persisted for a long time with X number of individuals, or in certain size of occupied area, then that's an indication that is a viable population, right? Because it has been there for a long time. There are records going back decades that there is a population there. Then that means you can use that as an indication that that's a viable population. Or if you study a population and you see that there is continuing and sufficient recruitment in a population of X mature individuals, again, that's an indication that that population is viable. Second decision is what is isolated. And again, that means that it's too far away from other subpopulations for recolonization to occur with a high probability. And the evidence that you use is dispersal distances of the species, dispersal ability of the species. If you don't know that dispersal ability of similar species, all these dispersal related attributes of the species go into this consideration. Now, once you have considered these, again, I want to mention the Red List tool here because it allows you to then calculate whether severely fragmented is correct or not based on the maps and other information that you enter. Now, I want to give a few examples because, as I said, this is frequently misunderstood and misapplied. So here's a case. Again, this text here is to just remind you what the definitions are, right? So we have a map. This is obviously a map of habitat fragmentation, but we cannot judge based on that whether it is severely fragmented or not, because we don't know anything about population. So it's about, this is only habitat fragmentation. So you have to say in this case, severely fragmented is unknown. Now, suppose we have population information that we know approximately. These don't have to be exact numbers. Very approximate numbers are okay. These are the number of mature individuals in each of these subpopulations. Would this be considered fragmented? Again, we cannot say this. We have to say it's unknown because we don't know what we should consider to be a viable population. And so let's look at some examples. Suppose we decided that to be viable, a population has to be 40 individuals or more, right? So if we make that decision, then 140 individuals are in large or viable populations, and the rest, which is 70 individuals, 30 plus 15 plus 25, are in non-viable populations. So the number of individuals in viable populations is higher. As a result, this is not severely fragmented. Now, let's say, what if the threshold was 50 individuals? If that's the case, then the only viable population is the big one, right? 100 individuals. Everything else is not viable, and they are isolated. So the total of the others, 25 plus 40 plus 30 plus 15, is 110. So more individuals are in small and isolated populations. So this will be severely fragmented. Now, if these two are connected with dispersal, then again, this is not severely fragmented because this 15 is no longer small and isolated. It is small, but it's not isolated. So the number of individuals in viable or connected populations is 115, and the number that is in populations that are both small and isolated is 95. So again, more of the individuals are in viable or connected populations. So this is not severely fragmented. Two other clarifications, because again, this comes up. Can a taxon with a single population be severely fragmented? It can be, but the condition for it is that that subpopulation, if it is too small to be viable, then it is considered severely fragmented. Now, this is not an important thing in a sense, because in that case, if there is a single subpopulation and it is too small to be viable, it would probably be meeting criterion D anyway, right? But just for completeness of the logic, that will be considered severely fragmented. But if the population is large, then it will not be considered severely fragmented, right? Even if it's a single population and it is several hundred individuals, it's not severely fragmented. Another question that comes up is, can two subpopulations be severely fragmented? They can be with this definition if they are isolated from each other and both are too small to be viable. So if there are two small populations, let's say 20, 30 individuals each, and they are isolated, that is definitely severely fragmented because 100% of the individuals are in small isolated populations. But if the larger of the two subpopulations is large enough to be viable, then they are not isolated, or they are not isolated, the taxon is not severely fragmented. Because if one is large enough to be viable, that means more than half is in the viable, so it's not severely fragmented. Okay, so final clarification. Just to mention again, severely fragmented is usually understood quite well, but sometimes it's confused with location. But it is really independent of the concept of location. As taxon can be severely fragmented, yet all the isolated populations may be threatened by the same major factor. And that means there will be a single location. So all of them may be in a single location, or each subpopulation may be threatened by a different factor, in which case there will be many locations, right? Also important to remember that severe fragmentation does not require an ongoing threat. The populations being small and isolated is sufficient because small and isolated subpopulations can go extinct due to natural stochastic processes, and they don't need a threat to be considered severely fragmented. So that is the end of the topics that I want to cover. We can have any final questions that you have on any of the topics, or any topic that I did not cover. That's perfectly fine. And again, to remind you, these three resources that are useful for red listing.
Thank you very much, Resit.
Any questions?
James, would you like to unmute?
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much. That was really great. I'm actually going to bring up a question that I think Resit came to you via Janice, Chanson and Craig from a recent assessments we've been doing for Norfolk Island invertebrates. We had a situation where we're working on an archipelago, and we have a large island and a small island, and the population on the very small island is doing well, but the population on the much larger island is declining. And we were just kind of going backwards and forwards whether we were triggering, which criteria exactly we were triggering and which we weren't. And yeah, just if you remember the question you answered, I haven't responded to your email yet, sorry, but just wondered if you could touch on that maybe.
Yeah, so in that case, the species that is declining in the larger island and not declining in the smaller island, because of the area that is that area of occupancy and other factors is listed. It would be listed as a endangered species because of decline, right? And but if it declines to a point where the species is only in the smaller island where it is not declining, would that be suddenly, because it is now more restricted, would it be considered vulnerable? In other words, improve its extinction risk, even though now it's in a smaller place? And my answer was that no, you would still consider it endangered because you would consider continuing decline in area of occupancy, extent of occurrence, and number of locations, because the species has recently declined from 2 locations to 1 location, right? Or from 2 subpopulations to 1 subpopulation. So decline in number of subpopulations will be continuing decline, and it still will be listed as an endangered species. Now, if after a while it is still not declining in the small island, then we will, and this continuing decline is in the past, it's no longer continuing. In that case, we would consider it vulnerable. In that case, the category will improve. Now, that may sound to some like a contradiction. If there are 2 species, one is occupying a larger area, one is smaller area, why is the larger area more threatened? But that is not a contradiction in my mind, and because it's not the state of the species in terms of the area or number of individuals that determines risk. What determines risk is the change in that state and how recently that change occurred. So it's the same issue as if a population is declining, it will be listed under criterion A, and then if it declines, becomes small, but then stabilizes. If it stabilizes for 3 generations, then we call it least concern, unless it meets other criteria. But there are many species like that are still abundant enough to not trigger any other criteria, but they are very small compared to their historical population. So initially, when they first start declining, they're listed as threatened species. After a while, if they stabilize, they are not listed as threatened species. So my general, so that's how to think about it. But my general advice is that don't be concerned about consistency or not consistency about with different species. Apply the criteria for a given species based on the data for that species. That is the way to make it, I think, to make it work.
Fantastic. No, that really yeah, clarifies that a lot. Thank you. There's a couple of cases where we've got similar patterns occurring for those species, so that's very helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
If I could ask a follow-on question from that, actually. So you say after a while, when it's stabilized, then you'd list it as vulnerable D2. How long was a while in that case?
I don't remember now, but in the section on continuing decline, so the continuing decline, as I mentioned, is recent, ongoing, or future decline. So continuing decline is actually a strange term. It can apply to past as well as future as well as current. So there is some guidance about that. I think it is like, it's a short time, it's like 1 generation or something. It's not like 3 generations. In the case of criterion A, it's 3 generations.
Thank you. I'll check. I think Sybil put her hand back up again. Sybil, did you have another question?
Apologies, it's been popping up and down. I was kind of wondering, we have a system in Canada where we're relying our CSIWIC, which you're probably familiar with, relies heavily on the IUCN Red List. And as I was trying to explain in my questions, we have a bit of an issue in terms of they're looking at the bottom end of a curve where things appear to be bottoming out, but we don't really, if we go to the 3 generations and 10 years, then it's really no longer fitting the risk of extinction category, because we're just comparing to recent, but really we're miles away from recovering the species, and then they resubmit it as no longer endangered, and it's or no longer threatened, or even no longer special concern. And so we're looking at being feeling like obliged to delist something when we're really not happy with its status yet. And I was just really curious. I was unaware, and perhaps the only person on the call that was, of the green list and the definitions of recovery that you've written a paper on, I see. And I was just wondering what your degree of comfort would be if with our measuring recovery, using those tools basically to measure whether or not the species has recovered adequately to be delisted, rather than looking at the fact it must no longer like imminently going extinct, but it's still not doing well.
So I don't know what you mean by those tools.
Oh, I'm referring to your green list and the definition of recovery also was another.
So the green status of species, it's not list anymore. When we wrote the paper, it was green list, but then we decided that it's too confusing because it's not really a list. Like, it doesn't mean the green listed doesn't mean that the species has recovered. Green status means that you assess the status of the species. So many of the species that are actually assessed with the green status of species are assessed as severely depleted. In other words, they are really far from their historical baselines. So green status doesn't mean that it is fine or recovered. It just means I am going to calculate how recovered it is. And then I will calculate how much of that I can take credit for, basically attribute to conservation. But that's a different story. So yes, I would be very comfortable with that, because in that case, you are not saying that the species is recovered, but you are saying how far away from full recovery versus extinction the species is. Where is the species in that range where 0 is extinction and 100% is full recovery? So a species may be least concern, and that recovery proportion may be just, let's say, 20%, right? If a species has declined a lot and then has stabilized for a long time, it will be least concern, but it will still be severely depleted. And there are examples of species like that. For instance, let me give you one example. The American bison, right? It's a near threatened species, but no one can possibly say that there is no conservation concern, that it's not a recovered species. It's very far from being recovered. It's severely depleted still, but it does not have any risk of extinction right now, right? So because Red List is only measuring the risk of extinction, and you cannot say American bison is going to go extinct. It's far from it. It's never going to go extinct, hopefully, but it doesn't mean it's recovered. So yes, please take a look at those metrics.
perfect example, because we do have bison is in that situation. We have two subspecies that we recognize in Canada. So we have bison, which is the plains, but we also have a wood bison, and Athabasca is the subspecies, and that one has been assessed as special concern, and we actually don't want to delist it for that reason, and yet, or to downlist it, because the Indigenous peoples in the area still want it to have some protections, but it will lose those protections if we take it down to special concern. Other example is sort of all the birds, pretty much. They've declined, most of them. Certainly all the insectivores have declined 70% from when I was a child, and yet we've got CSIWIC reassessing them according to the Red List standards, and they're telling us, oh, they're special concern and not at risk. And this is concern to us because we would like to do more to recover them before we take them off the list. So thanks, I'll take a look at those. Yeah.
Okay, so two things. Obviously, I can't, my jurisdiction doesn't extend to Canada, so I can't say
Understood, you don't have the jurisdiction. I was more just going for your opinion, thanks.
Yeah, I understand. So what I was going to say is that I can't say anything about Canada, but for IUCN Red List, definitely that is not allowed. In other words, not delisting a species because you want it to have continued protection is definitely absolutely not allowed, because we are only measuring the extinction risk. We are not measuring what happens if you don't have a threatened status. That is measured by something called conservation dependence, and green status of species has a metric called conservation dependence. It measures what would the status of the species be if conservation is stopped. And that is the metric that really should be used to determine what conservation is needed. The Red List categories is not a suitable metric for that. Conservation dependence is the suitable metric for that. So for Red List assessments, we apply the criteria just as is, and no adjustments based on conservation concerns is allowed, because as I said, that is a slippery slope and actually in the long run damages the reputation of the Red List, because it becomes basically a policy tool instead of an objective scientific tool. Let the policymakers and the managers and the wildlife managers make decisions based on the Red List and the green status of species. Our job is to correctly identify the extinction risk of the species based on its current data.
That's perfect. That's very helpful, because I think it's exactly that conservation dependence factor that we're omitting in our current processes. So I can bring this to other people and see what we can do to get it into our policies for how we apply the Act. Thanks very much. It's been very helpful. I've learned a lot.
Great, thank you.
This is possibly something which I ought to know, but I don't work on green status particularly. I just work on the Red List. In terms of national or regional guidelines for green status of species, are they still on the way?
So in the green status guidelines, there is a section on national assessments, but we recently hired someone specifically for the purpose of developing new guidelines for national assessments. So we are meeting regularly to get to that point. If you are interested in national level assessments, please contact me and I'll put you in contact with that person, because we are looking for examples of national green status assessments to see what kind of issues emerge and what kind of guidance is necessary for regional or national assessments.
Thanks, I will, for sure. Thank you very much.
Okay, does anyone have any last fairly short questions for Resit before we wrap up? Yes, James, you put your hand back up again.
Hi, hopefully this isn't too long then if we're wrapping up in 5 minutes, but I was just wanting to ask around near threatened in relation to, particularly in relation to criteria D and D2, where we've got instances, again, I'm talking about a very small archipelago, the whole island group is only 37 square kilometres. So any endemic species has a very small AOO and EOO. And we've got quite a few species that are only found in the national park, which is even smaller again, but some of them sort of spill into the surrounding landscape and don't quite trigger that, potential future threat under D2, but they're very reliant on that population. And yeah, I just wondered if you had any advice on using near threatened in relation to those criteria, Resit?
I can't remember now. I think we had some discussions on this, but basically the critical thing about D2 is that it's not the area really or the number of locations, but it is the likelihood that if a event occurs, a threatening event occurs, the species may be extinct or critically endangered in a very short time. As you know, near threatened category does not have numerical thresholds. It is basically closeness to the vulnerable threshold that determines. So if you can argue that the situation is on the edge of being the vulnerable category, but not quite, that is the definition of near threatened. So if you can argue that is I think you can you can use near threatened category in that case. Okay. I mean, it depends on the detail, so I cannot say yes or no directly right now. But what you described sounds reasonable to me.
Yes, many of the species only in the park we're going to propose their D2 because it's at high risk of wildfire, which would drive them all to critically endangered very, very quickly. So it's these species that kind of spill out into the surrounding landscape where most of their population would be destroyed by the fire. So then I think they would very quickly go to critically endangered under B at the least. But yeah, some of them, they're probably not quite ticking the box for D2. So no, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Oh, another way of looking at that, and Resit, please correct me if I'm wrong, would be that if a threat could rapidly drive the species to endangered rather than to critically endangered or to extinct, then that would be near threatened, vulnerable, nearly meeting vulnerable D2 as well.
Yes, thank you. That's true.
Great. Thanks very much.
And for that, it's helpful, I find, to think about what criteria would be met rather than just thinking, I'm sure the threat could drive it to endangered. Like what thresholds are going to be met in that case. Okay, I think we're about out of time, so let's wrap up there. Thank you very much, Resit, and thanks to all of you for attending and posing some really interesting questions. That's all we've got time for today, but this webinar series will continue early next year on different topics. We'll have sessions on how to get the most out of the Red List website, because there's a lot more data and functionality there than lots of people realise. And also one on what we check in the IUCN Red List unit after assessments are submitted to us, and therefore how to make sure that you don't hit any hiccups or delays in the publication process. I'll circulate the dates and details of those webinars as soon as they're confirmed. And just like this time, each webinar will be run in 2 different times, different sessions. So all that remains is to wish you all a good morning, a good afternoon, a good evening, or a good night, depending on where you joined us from today. Thank you again, Resit. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Bye.